Chapter 3, Part 1 of Hilda Wade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Hilda Wade, A Woman with Tenacity of Purpose by Grant Allen. Chapter 3, Part 1. The episode of the wife who did her duty. To make you understand my next yarn, I must go back to the date of my introduction to Hilda. "It is witchcraft," I said the first time I saw her at Legate's luncheon party. She smiled a smile which was bewitching indeed, but by no means witch-like, a frank, open smile, with just a touch of natural feminine triumph in it. "No, not witchcraft," she answered, helping herself with her dainty fingers to a burnt almond from the Venetian glass dish. "Not witchcraft. Memory, aided perhaps by some native quickness of perception. Though I say it myself, I never met anyone, I think, whose memory goes quite as far as mine does." "You don't mean quite as far back?" I cried, jesting, for she looked about 24 and had cheeks like a ripe nectarine, just as pink and just as softly downy. She smiled again, showing a row of semi-transparent teeth with a gleam in the depths of them. She was certainly most attractive. She had that indefinable, incommunicable, unanalyzable personal quality which we know as charm. "No, not as far back," she repeated, "though indeed I often seem to remember things that happened before I was born, like Queen Elizabeth's visit to Kenilworth. I recollect so vividly all that I have heard or read about them. But as far in extent, I mean. I never let anything drop out of my memory. As this case shows you, I can recall even quite unimportant and casual bits of knowledge when any chance clue happens to bring them back to me." She had certainly astonished me. The occasion for my astonishment was the fact that when I handed her my card, Dr. Hubert Cumberledge, St. Nathaniel's Hospital, she had glanced at it for a second and exclaimed without sensible pause or break, "Oh, then of course you're half Welsh, as I am." The instantaneous and apparent inconsecutiveness of her inference took me aback. "Well, yes, I am half Welsh," I replied. "My mother came from Carnivore, but why then, and of course? I fail to perceive your train of reasoning." She laughed a sunny little laugh, like one well accustomed to receive such inquiries. "Fancy asking a woman to give you the train of reasoning for her intuitions!" she cried merrily. "That shows, Dr. Cumberledge, that you are a mere man, a man of science, perhaps, but not a psychologist. It also suggests that you are a confirmed bachelor. A married man accepts intuitions without expecting them to be based on reasoning. Well, just this once I will stretch a point to enlighten you. If I recollect right, your mother died about 3 years ago?" "You are quite correct. Then you knew my mother?" "Oh, dear me, no. I never even met her. Why then?" Her look was mischievous. "But unless I mistake, I think she came from Henrequed, near Bangor." "Wales is a village," I exclaimed, catching my breath. "Every Welsh person seems to know all about every other." My new acquaintance smiled again. When she smiled she was irresistible, a laughing face protruding from a cloud of diaphanous drapery. "Now shall I tell you how I came to know that?" she asked, poising a glazed cherry on her desert fork in front of her. "Shall I explain my trick like the conjurers?" "Conjurers never explain anything," I answered. "They say, 'So you see, that's how it's done,' with a swift whisk of the hand, and leave you as much in the dark as ever. Don't explain like the conjurers, but tell me how you guessed it." She shut her eyes and seemed to turn her glance inward. "About 3 years ago. she began slowly, like one who reconstructs with an effort a half forgotten scene. "I saw a notice in the Times: births, deaths, and marriages. On the 27th of October, was it the 27th?" The keen brown eyes opened again for a second and flashed inquiry into mine. "Quite right," I answered, nodding. "I thought so. On the 27th of October, at Brynmore, Bournemouth, Emily Olwen Josephine, widow of the late Thomas Cumberledge, sometime Colonel of the 7th Bengal Regiment of Foot, and daughter of Iolo Gwyn Ford, Esquire, J.P., of Henry Quaid, near Bangor. Am I correct?" She lifted her dark eyelashes once more and flooded me. "You are quite correct," I answered, surprised. "And that is really all that you knew of my mother?" "Absolutely all. The moment I saw your card, I thought to myself in a breath, Ford, Cumberledge, what do I know of those two names? I have some link between them. Ah, yes, found Mrs. Cumberledge, wife of Colonel Thomas Cumberledge, of the 7th Bengals, was a Miss Ford, daughter of a Mr. Ford of Bangor. That came to me like a lightning gleam. Then I said to myself again, Dr. Hubert Ford Cumberledge must be their son. So there you have the train of reasoning. Women can reason sometimes. I had to think twice, though, before I could recall the exact words of the Times notice." "And you can do the same with every one?" "Every one? Oh, come now, that is expecting too much. I have not read, marked, learned, and inwardly digested every one's family announcements. I don't pretend to be the peerage, the clergy list, and the London Directory rolled into one. I remembered your family all the more vividly, no doubt because of the pretty and unusual old Welsh names, Olwen and Iolo Gwyn Ford, which fixed themselves on my memory by their mere beauty. Everything about Wales always attracts me. My Welsh side is uppermost. But I have hundreds, oh, thousands of such facts stored and pigeon-holed in my memory. If anybody else cares to try me," she glanced round the table, "perhaps we may be able to test my power that way." Two or three of the company accepted her challenge, giving the full names of their sisters or brothers, and in 3 cases out of 5 my witch was able to supply either the notice of their marriage or some other like published circumstance. In the instance of Charlie Vere, it is true she went wrong, just at first, though only in a single small particular. It was not Charlie himself who was gazetted to a sub-lieutenancy in the Warwickshire regiment, but his brother Walter. However, the moment she was told of this slip, she corrected herself at once and added like lightning, "Ah, yes, how stupid of me! I have mixed up the names. Charles Cassilis Vere got an appointment on the same day in the Rhodesian Mounted Police, didn't he?" Which was in point of fact quite accurate. But I am forgetting that all this time I have not even now introduced my witch to you. Hilda Wade, when I first saw her, was one of the prettiest, cheeriest, and most graceful girls I have ever met. A dusky blonde, brown-eyed, brown-haired, with a creamy, waxen whiteness of skin that was yet warm and peachy downy. And I wish to insist from the outset upon the plain fact that there was nothing uncanny about her. In spite of her singular faculty of insight, which sometimes seemed to illogical people almost weird or eerie, she was, in the main, a bright, well-educated, sensible, winsome, lawn-tennis playing English girl. Her vivacious spirits rose superior to her surroundings, which were often sad enough. But she was above all things wholesome, unaffected, and sparkling, a gleam of sunshine. She laid no claim to supernatural powers. She held no dealings with familiar spirits. She was simply a girl of strong personal charm, endowed with an astounding memory and a rare measure of feminine intuition. Her memory, she told me, she shared with her father and all her father's family. They were famous for their prodigious faculty in that respect. Her impulsive temperament and quick instincts, on the other hand, descended to her, she thought, from her mother and her Welsh ancestry. Externally she seemed thus at first sight little more than the ordinary pretty, light-hearted English girl, with a taste for field sports, especially riding, and a native love for the country. But at times one caught in the brightened color of her lustrous brown eyes certain curious undercurrents of depth, of reserve, and of a questioning wistfulness, which made you suspect the presence of profounder elements in her nature. From the earliest moment of our acquaintance, indeed, I can say with truth that Hilda Wade interested me immensely. I felt drawn. Her face had that strange quality of compelling attention, for which we have as yet no English name, but which everybody recognizes. You could not ignore her. She stood out. She was the sort of girl one was constrained to notice. It was Legate's first luncheon party since his second marriage. Big bearded, genial, he beamed round on us jubilant. He was proud of his wife and proud of his recent Q.C.ship. The new Mrs. Legate sat at the head of the table, handsome, capable, self-possessed, a vivid, vigorous woman, and a model hostess. Though still quite young, she was large and commanding. Everybody was impressed by her. Such a good mother to those poor motherless children, all the ladies declared in a chorus of applause, and indeed she had the face of a splendid manager. I said as much in an undertone over the ices to Miss Wade, who sat beside me, though I ought not to have discussed them at their own table. "Hugo Legate seems to have made an excellent choice," I murmured. "Mace and Etty will be lucky indeed to be taken care of by such a competent stepmother. Don't you think so?" My witch glanced up at her hostess with a piercing dart of the keen brown eyes, held her wine glass half raised, and then electrified me by uttering, in the same low voice, audible to me alone, but quite clearly and unhesitatingly, these astounding words: "I think, before 12 months are out, Mr. Legate will have murdered her." For a minute I could not answer, so startling was the effect of this confident prediction. One does not expect to be told such things at lunch, over the port and peaches, about one's dearest friends, beside their own mahogany. And the assured air of unfaltering conviction with which Hilda Wade said it to a complete stranger took my breath away. Why did she think so at all? And if she thought so, why choose me as the recipient of her singular confidences? I gasped and wondered. "What makes you fancy anything so unlikely?" I asked aside at last, behind the babel of voices. "You quite alarm me." She rolled a mouthful of apricot ice reflectively on her tongue, and then murmured in a similar aside: "Don't ask me now. Some other time will do. But I mean what I say. Believe me, I do not speak at random." She was quite right, of course. To continue would have been equally rude and foolish. I had perforce to bottle up my curiosity for the moment and wait till my Sybil was in the mood for interpreting. After lunch we adjourned to the drawing room. Almost at once Hilda Wade flitted up with her brisk step to the corner where I was sitting. "Oh, Dr. Cumberledge," she began, as if nothing odd had occurred before, "I was so glad to meet you and have a chance of talking to you, because I do so want to get a nurse's place at St. Nathaniel's." "A nurse's place!" I exclaimed, a little surprised, surveying her dress of palest and softest Indian muslin, for she looked to me far too much of a butterfly for such serious work. "Do you really mean it, or are you one of the 10,000 modern young ladies who are in quest of a mission, without understanding that missions are unpleasant? Nursing, I can tell you, is not all crimped cap and becoming uniform." "I know that," she answered, growing grave. "I ought to know it. I am a nurse already at St. George's Hospital." "You are a nurse, and at St. George's? Yet you want to change to Nathaniel's. Why? St. George's is in a much nicer part of London, and the patients there come on an average from a much better class than ours in Smithfield." "I know that too, but Sebastian is at St. Nathaniel's, and I want to be near Sebastian." "Professor Sebastian!" I cried, my face lighting up with a gleam of enthusiasm at our great teacher's name. "Ah, if it is to be under Sebastian that you desire, I can see you mean business. I know now you are in earnest." "In earnest?" she echoed, that strange deeper shade coming over her face as she spoke, while her tone altered. "Yes, I think I am in earnest. It is my object in life to be near Sebastian, to watch him and observe him, I mean to succeed. But I have given you my confidence, perhaps too hastily, and I must implore you not to mention my wish to him." "You may trust me implicitly," I answered. "Oh, yes, I saw that," she put in with a quick gesture. "Of course, I saw by your face you were a man of honor, a man one could trust, or I would not have spoken to you. But you promise me?" "I promise you," I replied, naturally flattered. She was delicately pretty, and her quaint oracular air, so incongruous with the dainty face and the fluffy brown hair, piqued me not a little. That special mysterious commodity of charm seemed to pervade all she did and said. So I added, "And I will mention to Sebastian that you wish for a nurse's place at Nathaniel's. As you have had experience and can be recommended, I suppose, by Legate's sister, with whom she had come, no doubt you can secure an early vacancy." "Thanks so much," she answered, with that delicious smile. It had an infantile simplicity about it, which contrasted most piquantly with her prophetic manner. "Only," I went on, assuming a confidential tone, "you really must tell me why you said that just now about Hugo Legate. Recollect, your Delphian utterances have gravely astonished and disquieted me. Hugo is one of my oldest and dearest friends, and I want to know why you have formed this sudden bad opinion of him." "Not of him, but of her," she answered, to my surprise, taking a small Norwegian dagger from the whatnot and playing with it to distract attention. "Come, come now," I cried, drawing back. "You are trying to mystify me. This is deliberate seermongery. You are presuming on your powers. But I'm not the sort of man to be caught by horoscopes. I decline to believe it." She turned on me with a meaning glance. Those truthful eyes fixed me. "I am going from here straight to my hospital," she murmured with a quiet air of knowledge, talking, I mean to say, like one who really knows. "This room is not the place to discuss this matter, is it? If you will walk back to St. George's with me, I think I can make you see and feel that I am speaking not at haphazard, but from observation and experience." Her confidence roused my most vivid curiosity. When she left, I left with her. The Legates lived in one of those new streets of large houses on Campden Hill, so that our way eastward lay naturally through Kensington Gardens. It was a sunny June day, when light pierced even through the smoke of London, and the shrubberies breathed the breath of white lilacs. "Now, what did you mean by that enigmatical saying?" I asked my new Cassandra, as we strolled down the scent laden path. "Woman's intuition is all very well in its way, but a mere man be excused if he asks for evidence." She stopped short as I spoke, and gazed full into my eyes. Her hand fingered her parasol handle. "I meant what I said," she answered with emphasis. "Within 1 year Mr. Legate will have murdered his wife. You may take my word for it." "Legate!" I cried. "Never! I know the man so well. A big, good-natured, kindly schoolboy. He's the gentlest and best of mortals. Legate a murderer! Impossible!" Her eyes were far away. "Has it never occurred to you," she asked slowly, with her pythoness air, "that there are murders and murders? Murders which depend in the main upon the murderer, and also murders which depend in the main upon the victim?" "The victim? What do you mean?" "Well, there are brutal men who commit murder out of sheer brutality, the ruffians of the slums, and there are sordid men who commit murder for sordid money, the insurers who want to forestall their policies, the poisoners who want to inherit property. But have you ever realized that there are also murderers who become so by accident, through their victims' idiosyncrasy? I thought all the time while I was watching Mrs. Legate, that woman is of the sort predestined to be murdered. And when you asked me, I told you so. I may have been imprudent, still I saw it, and I said it." "But this is second sight," I cried, drawing away. "Do you pretend to prevision?" "No, not second sight, nothing uncanny, nothing supernatural, but prevision, yes, prevision based not on omens or auguries, but on solid fact, on what I have seen and noticed." "Explain yourself, O prophetess." She let the point of her parasol make a curved trail on the gravel, and followed its serpentine wavings with her eyes. "You know our house surgeon?" she asked at last, looking up of a sudden. "What, Travers? Oh, intimately." "Then come to my ward and see. After you have seen, you will perhaps believe me." Nothing that I could say would get any further explanation out of her just then. "You would laugh at me if I told you," she persisted. "You won't laugh when you have seen it." We walked on in silence as far as Hyde Park Corner. There my swings tripped lightly up the steps of St. George's Hospital. "Get Mr. Travers's leave," she said with a nod and a bright smile, "to visit Nurse Wade's ward? Then come up to me there in 5 minutes." I explained to my friend the house surgeon that I wished to see certain cases in the accident ward of which I had heard. He smiled a restrained smile. "Nurse Wade, no doubt," but, of course, gave me permission to go up and look at them. "Stop a minute," he added, "and I'll come with you." When we got there my witch had already changed her dress, and was waiting for us demurely in the neat dove colored gown and smooth white apron of the hospital nurses. She looked even prettier and more meaningful so than in her ethereal outside summer cloud muslin. "Come over to this bed," she said at once to Travers and myself, without the least air of mystery. "I will show you what I mean by it." "Nurse Wade has remarkable insight," Travers whispered to me as we went. "I can believe it," I answered. "Look at this woman," she went on aside in a low voice. "No, not the first bed, the one beyond it, number 60. I don't want the patient to know you are watching her. Do you observe anything odd about her appearance?" "She is somewhat the same type," I began, "as Mrs." Before I could get out the words, Legate, her warning eye and puckering forehead, had stopped me. "As the lady we were discussing," she interposed with a quiet wave of one hand. "Yes, in some points very much so. You notice in particular her scanty hair? So thin and poor, though she is young and good looking." "It is certainly rather a feeble crop for a woman of her age," I admitted, "and pale at that, and washy." "Precisely. It's done up behind about as big as a nutmeg. Now observe the contour of her back as she sits up there. It is curiously curved, isn't it?" "Very," I replied. "Not exactly a stoop, nor yet quite a hunch, but certainly an odd spinal configuration." "Like our friend's, once more?" "Like our friend's, exactly." Hilda Wade looked away, lest she should attract the patient's attention. "Well, that woman was brought in here half dead, assaulted by her husband," she went on, with a note of unobtrusive demonstration. "We get a great many such cases," Travers put in with true medical unconcern. "Very interesting cases, and Nurse Wade has pointed out to me the singular fact that in almost all instances the patients resemble one another physically." "Incredible!" I cried. "I can understand that there might well be a type of men who assault their wives, but not surely a type of women who get assaulted." "That is because you know less about it than Nurse Wade," Travers answered, with an annoying smile of superior knowledge. Our instructress moved on to another bed, laying one gentle hand as she passed on a patient's forehead. The patient glanced gratitude. "That one again," she said once more, half indicating a cot at a little distance. "Number 74. She has much the same thin hair, sparse, weak, and colorless. She has much the same curved back, and much the same aggressive, self-assertive features. Looks capable, doesn't she? A born housewife. Well, she too was knocked down and kicked half dead the other night by her husband." "It is certainly odd," I answered, "how very much they both recall " "Our friend at lunch? Yes, extraordinary. See here." She pulled out a pencil and drew the quick outline of a face in her notebook. "That is what is central and essential to the type. They have this sort of profile. Women with faces like that always get assaulted." Travers glanced over her shoulder. "Quite true," he assented with his bourgeois nod. "Nurse Wade in her time has shown me dozens of them. Round dozens, baker's dozens. They all belong to that species. In fact, when a woman of this type is brought in to us wounded now, I ask at once, 'Husband?' and the invariable answer comes pat, 'Well, yes, sir, we had some words together.' The effect of words, my dear fellow, is something truly surprising." "They can pierce like a dagger," I mused. "And leave an open wound behind that requires dressing," Travers added, unsuspecting. Practical man, Travers. "But why do they get assaulted, the women of this type?" I asked, still bewildered. "Number 87 has her mother just come to see her," my sorceress interposed. "She's an assault case, brought in last night, badly kicked and bruised about the head and shoulders. Speak to the mother. She'll explain it all to you." End of chapter 3, part 1. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 3, part 2 of Hilda Wade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Hilda Wade, A Woman with Tenacity of Purpose, by Grant Allen. Chapter 3, Part 2. Travers and I moved over to the cot her hand scarcely indicated. "Well, your daughter looks pretty comfortable this afternoon, in spite of the little fuss," Travers began tentatively. "Yes, she is a bit tidy, thank'ee," the mother answered, smoothing her soiled black gown, grown green with long service. "She'll get on now, please good. But Joe most did for her." "How did it all happen?" Travers asked in a jaunty tone, to draw her out. "Well, it was like this, sir, yer see. My daughter, she's a liddy as keeps herself to herself, as the sayin' is, and holds her head up. She keeps up a proper pride, and minds her 'ouse and her little uns. She ain't no gadabat, but she 'ave a tongue, she 'ave." The mother lowered her voice cautiously, lest the liddy should hear. "I don't deny it that she 'ave a tongue at times, though, through myself having suffered from it. And when she do go on, Lord bless you, why there ain't no stopping of her." "Oh, she has a tongue, has she?" Travers replied, surveying the case critically. "Well, you know, she looks like it." "So she do, sir, so she do. And Joe, he's a man as wouldn't hurt a biby, not when he's sober. Joe wouldn't.
But he'd been at, that's where it is, and he come home late, a bit fresh, through having been at the Friendly Lead, and me daughter Yersey, she up and give it to him. My word, she did give it to him. And yo, he's a peaceable man when he ain't a bit fresh. He's more like a friend to her than a husband. Yo is. But he lost his temper that time, as you may say, by reason of being fresh, and he knocked her about a little, and knocked her teeth out. So we brought her to the hospital." The injured woman raised herself up in bed with a vindictive scowl, displaying as she did so the same whale-like curved back as in the other cases. "But we've sent him to the lock-up," she continued, the scowl giving way fast to a radiant joy of victory as she contemplated her triumph. "And what's more, I had the last word of him, and he'll get 6 months for this, the neighbour says. And when he comes out again, my God, won't he catch it!" "You look capable of punishing him for it," I answered as I spoke. I shuddered, for I saw her expression was precisely the expression Mrs. Legate's face had worn for a passing second when her husband accidentally trod on her dress as we left the dining room. My witch moved away. We followed. "Well, what do you say to it now?" she asked, gliding among the beds with noiseless feet and ministering fingers. "Say to it," I answered, "that it is wonderful, wonderful. You have quite convinced me." "You would think so," Travers put in, "if you had been in this ward as often as I have, and observed their faces. It's a dead certainty. Sooner or later that type of woman is cocksure to be assaulted." "In a certain rank of life, perhaps," I answered, still loth to believe it, "but not surely in ours. Gentlemen do not knock down their wives and kick their teeth out." My Sybil smiled. "No, their class tells," she admitted. "They take longer about it, and suffer more provocation. They curb their tempers, but in the end, one day, they are goaded beyond endurance, and then a convenient knife, a rusty old sword, a pair of scissors, anything that comes handy, like that dagger this morning, one wild blow, half unpremeditated, and the thing is done. 12 good men and true will find it wilful murder." I felt really perturbed. "But can we do nothing," I cried, "to warn poor Hugo?" "Nothing, I fear," she answered. "After all, character must work itself out in its interactions with character. He has married that woman, and he must take the consequences. Does not each of us in life suffer perforce the nemesis of his own temperament?" "Then is there not also a type of men who assault their wives?" "That is the odd part of it. No. All kinds, good and bad, quick and slow, can be driven to it at last. The quick tempered stab or kick, the slow devise some deliberate means of ridding themselves of their burden. But surely we might caution Legate of his danger." "It is useless. He would not believe us. We cannot be at his elbow to hold back his hand when the bad moment comes. Nobody will be there, as a matter of fact, for women of this temperament, born naggers, in short, since that's what it comes to, when they are also ladies, graceful and gracious as she is, never nag at all before outsiders. To the world they are bland. Everybody says, 'What charming talkers!' They are angels abroad, devils at home, as the proverb puts it. Some night she will provoke him, when they are alone, till she has reached his utmost limit of endurance, and then," she drew one hand across her dove-like throat, "it will be all finished." "You think so?" "I am sure of it. We human beings go straight like sheep to our natural destiny." "But that is fatalism." "No, not fatalism. Insight into temperament. Fatalists believe that your life is arranged for you beforehand from without, willy-nilly. You must act so." "I only believe that in this jostling world your life is mostly determined by your own character, in its interaction with the characters of those who surround you. Temperament works itself out. It is your own acts and deeds that make up fate for you." For some months after this meeting, neither Hilda Wade nor I saw anything more of the Legates. They left town for Scotland at the end of the season, and when all the grouse had been duly slaughtered, and all the salmon duly hooked, they went on to Leicestershire for the opening of fox hunting. So it was not till after Christmas that they returned to Campden Hill. Meanwhile I had spoken to Dr. Sebastian about Miss Wade, and on my recommendation he had found her a vacancy at our hospital.
"A most intelligent girl, Cumberledge," he remarked to me with a rare burst of approval, for the Professor was always critical, after she had been at work for some weeks at St. Nathaniel's. "I am glad you introduced her here. A nurse with brains is such a valuable accessory, unless of course she takes to thinking. But Nurse Wade never thinks. She is a useful instrument, does what she is told, and carries out one's orders implicitly." "She knows enough to know when she doesn't know," I answered, "which is really the rarest kind of knowledge." "Unrecorded among young doctors," the Professor retorted with his sardonic smile. "They think they understand the human body from top to toe, when in reality, well, they might do the measles."
Early in January I was invited again to lunch with the Legates. Hilda Wade was invited too. The moment we entered the house we were both of us aware that some grim change had come over it. Legate met us in the hall, in his old genial style, it is true, but still with a certain reserve, a curious veiled timidity which we had not known in him. Big and good humored as he was, with kindly eyes beneath the shaggy eyebrows, he seemed strangely subdued now. The boyish buoyancy had gone out of him. He spoke rather lower than was his natural key, and welcomed us warmly, though less effusively than of old. An irreproachable housemaid, in a spotless cap, ushered us into the transfigured drawing room. Mrs. Legate, in a pretty cloth dress, neatly tailor made, rose to meet us, beaming the vapid smile of the perfect hostess, that impartial smile which falls like the rain from heaven on good and bad indifferently. "So charmed to see you again, Dr. Cumberledge," she bubbled out with a cheerful air. She was always cheerful, mechanically cheerful, from a sense of duty. "It is such a pleasure to meet dear Hugo's old friends, and Miss Wade too. How delightful! You look so well, Miss Wade. Oh, you're both at St. Nathaniel's now, aren't you? So you can come together. What a privilege for you, Dr. Cumberledge, to have such a clever assistant, or rather fellow worker. It must be a great life, yours, Miss Wade, such a sphere of usefulness. If we can only feel we are doing good, that is the main matter. For my own part, I like to be mixed up with every good work that's going on in my neighborhood. I'm the soup kitchen, you know, and I'm visitor at the workhouse, and I'm the Dorcas Society, and the Mutual Improvement Class, and the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and to Children, and I'm sure I don't know how much else. So that, what with all that, and what with dear Hugo and the darling children," she glanced affectionately at Maisie and Etty, who sat bolt upright, very mute and still, in their best and stiffest frocks, on two stools in the corner, "I can hardly find time for my social duties."
"Oh, dear Mrs. Legate," one of her visitors said with effusion from beneath a nodding bonnet. She was the wife of a rural dean from Staffordshire. "Everybody's agreed that your social duties are performed to a marvel. They are the envy of Kensington."
We all of us wonder indeed how one woman can find time for all of it." Our hostess looked pleased. "Well, yes," she answered, gazing down at her fawn-coloured dress with a half suppressed smile of self-satisfaction. "I flatter myself I can get through about as much work in a day as anybody." Her eye wandered round her rooms with a modest air of placid self-approval which was almost comic. Everything in them was as well kept and as well polished as good servants, thoroughly drilled, could make it. Not a stain or a speck anywhere. A miracle of neatness. Indeed, when I carelessly drew the Norwegian dagger from its scabbard, as we waited for lunch, and found that it stuck in the sheath, I almost started to discover that rust could intrude into that orderly household. I recollected then how Hilda Wade had pointed out to me during those 6 months at St. Nathaniel's that the women whose husbands assaulted them were almost always notable housewives, as they say in America, good souls who prided themselves not a little on their skill in management. They were capable, practical mothers of families, with a boundless belief in themselves, a sincere desire to do their duty as far as they understood it, and a habit of impressing their virtues upon others which was quite beyond all human endurance. Placidity was their note, provoking placidity. I felt sure it must have been of a woman of this type that the famous phrase was coined, Elle a toutes les vertus et elle est insupportable. "Clara, dear," the husband said, "shall we go in to lunch?" "You dear, stupid boy, are we not all waiting for you to give your arm to Lady Maitland?" The lunch was perfect, and it was perfectly served. The silver glowed, the linen was marked with H. C. Le G. in a most artistic monogram. I noticed that the table decorations were extremely pretty. Somebody complimented our hostess upon them. Mrs. Legate nodded and smiled. "I arranged them. Dear Hugo, in his blundering way, the big darling, forgot to get me the orchids I had ordered, so I had to make shift with what few things our own wee conservatory afforded. Still, with a little taste and a little ingenuity." She surveyed her handiwork with just pride, and left the rest to our imaginations. "Only you ought to explain, Clara," Legate began in a deprecatory tone. "Now, you darling old bear, we won't harp on that twice told tale again," Clara interrupted with a knowing smile. "Point de réchauffe. Let us leave one another's misdeeds and one another's explanations for their proper sphere, the family circle. The orchids did not turn up, that is the point, and I managed to make shift with the plumbago and the geraniums. Maisie, my sweet, not that pudding, if you please. Too rich for you, darling? I know your digestive capacities better than you do. I have told you 50 times it doesn't agree with you. A small slice of the other one." "Yes, mamma," Maisie answered with a cowed and cowering air. I felt sure she would have murmured, "Yes, mamma," in the self same tone if the second Mrs. Legate had ordered her to hang herself. "I saw you in the park yesterday on your bicycle, Etty," Legate's sister, Mrs. Mallett, put in. "But do you know, dear, I didn't think your jacket was half warm enough." "Mamma doesn't like me to wear a warmer one," the child answered with a visible shudder of recollection, "though I should love to, Aunt Lina." "My precious Etty, what nonsense, for a violent exercise like bicycling, where one gets so hot, so unbecomingly hot. You'd be simply stifled, darling." I caught a darted glance which accompanied the words, and which made Etty recoil into the recesses of her pudding. "But yesterday was so cold, Clara," Mrs. Mallet went on, actually venturing to oppose the infallible authority. "A nipping morning, and such a flimsy coat. Might not the dear child be allowed to judge for herself in a matter purely of her own feelings?" Mrs. Legate, with just the shadow of a shrug, was all sweet reasonableness. She smiled more suavely than ever. "Surely, Lina," she remonstrated in her frankest and most convincing tone, "I must know best what is good for dear Etty, when I have been watching her daily for more than 6 months past, and taking the greatest pains to understand both her constitution and her disposition. She needs hardening, Etty does, hardening. Don't you agree with me, Hugo?" Legate shuffled uneasily in his chair. Big man as he was, with his great black beard and manly bearing, I could see he was afraid to differ from her overtly. "Well, perhaps, Clara," he began, peering from under the shaggy eyebrows, "it would be best for a delicate child like Etty." Mrs. Legate smiled a compassionate smile. "Ah, I forgot," she cawed sweetly. "Dear Hugo never can understand the upbringing of children. It is a sense denied him. We women know," with a sage nod. "They were wild little savages when I took them in hand first, weren't you, Maisie? Do you remember, dear, how you broke the looking glass in the boudoir like an untamed young monkey? Talking of monkeys, Mr. Cotswold, have you seen those delightful, clever, amusing French pictures at that place in Suffolk Street? There's a man there, a Parisian, I forget his honoured name, Leblanc or Lenoir or Lebrun or something, but he's a most humorous artist, and he paints monkeys and storks and all sorts of queer beasties, almost as quaintly and expressively as you do. Mind, I say almost, for I never will allow that any Frenchman could do anything quite so good, quite so funnily mock human as your marabouts and professors." "What a charming hostess Mrs. Legate makes," the painter observed to me after lunch. "Such tact, such discrimination, and what a devoted stepmother!" "She is one of the local secretaries of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children," I said dryly. "And charity begins at home," Hilda Wade added in a significant aside. We walked home together as far as Stanhope Gate. Our sense of doom oppressed us. "And yet," I said, turning to her as we left the doorstep, "I don't doubt Mrs. Legate really believes she is a model stepmother." "Of course she believes it," my witch answered. "She has no more doubt about that than about anything else. Doubts are not in her line. She does everything exactly as it ought to be done. Who should know if not she? And therefore she is never afraid of criticism. Hardening indeed, that poor, slender, tender, shrinking little Etty, a frail exotic. She would harden her into a skeleton if she had her way. Nothing's much harder than a skeleton, I suppose, except Mrs. Legate's manner of training one." "I should be sorry to think," I broke in, "that sweet little floating thistledown of a child I once knew was to be done to death by her." "Oh, as for that, she will not be done to death," Hilda answered in her confident way. "Mrs. Legate won't live long enough." I started. "You think not?" "I don't think, I'm sure of it. We are at the fifth act now. I watched Mr. Legate closely all through lunch, and I'm more confident than ever that the end is coming. He is temporarily crushed, but he is like steam in a boiler, seething, seething, seething. One day she will sit on the safety valve and the explosion will come. When it comes," she raised aloft one quick hand in the air as if striking a dagger home, "good bye to her." For the next few months I saw much of Legate, and the more I saw of him, the more I saw that my witch's prognosis was essentially correct. They never quarrelled, but Mrs. Legate, in her unobtrusive way, held a quiet hand over her husband, which became increasingly apparent. In the midst of her fancy work,
Those busy fingers were never idle. She kept her eyes well fixed on him. Now and again I saw him glance at his motherless girls with what looked like a tender, protecting regret, especially when Clara had been most openly drilling them. But he dared not interfere. She was crushing their spirit, as she was crushing their father's, and all, bear in mind, for the best of motives. She had their interest at heart. She wanted to do what was right for them. Her manner to him and to them was always honey sweet in all externals, yet one could somehow feel it was the velvet glove that masked the iron hand, not cruel, not harsh even, but severely, irresistibly, unflinchingly crushing. "Etty, my dear, get your brown hat at once. What's that? Going to rain? I did not ask you, my child, for your opinion on the weather. My own suffices. A headache? Oh, nonsense! Headaches are caused by want of exercise. Nothing so good for a touch of headache as a nice brisk walk in Kensington Gardens. Maisie, don't hold your sister's hand like that. It is imitation sympathy. You are aiding and abetting her in setting my wishes at naught. Now, no long faces. What I require is cheerful obedience." A bland, autocratic martinet, smiling, inexorable. Poor, pale Etty grew thinner and wanner under her law daily, while Maisie's temper, naturally docile, was being spoiled before one's eyes by persistent, needless thwarting. As spring came on, however, I began to hope that things were really mending. Legate looked brighter. Some of his own careless, happy-go-lucky self came back again at intervals. He told me once, with a wistful sigh, that he thought of sending the children to school in the country. It would be better for them, he said, and would take a little work off dear Clara's shoulders. For never, even to me, was he disloyal to Clara. I encouraged him in the idea. He went on to say that the great difficulty in the way was Clara. She was so conscientious. She thought it her duty to look after the children herself, and couldn't bear to delegate any part of that duty to others. Besides, she had such an excellent opinion of the Kensington High School. When I told Hilda Wade of this, she set her teeth together and answered at once: "That settles it. The end is very near. He will insist upon their going, to save them from that woman's ruthless kindness, and she will refuse to give up any part of what she calls her duty. He will reason with her. He will plead for his children. She will be adamant. Not angry. It is never the way of the temperament to get angry. Just calmly, sedately, and insupportably provoking. When she goes too far, he will flare up at last. Some taunt will rouse him. The explosion will come, and the children will go to their Aunt Lena, whom they dote upon. When all is said and done, it is the poor man I pity." "You said within 12 months?" "That was a bow drawn at a venture. It may be a little sooner, it may be a little later, but next week or next month. It is coming, it is coming." June smiled upon us once more, and on the afternoon of the 13th, the anniversary of our first lunch together at the Legates, I was up at my work in the accident ward at St. Nathaniel's. "Well, the Ediths of June have come, Sister Wade," I said, when I met her, parodying Caesar. "But not yet gone," she answered, and a profound sense of foreboding spread over her speaking face as she uttered the words. Her oracle disquieted me. "Why, I dined there last night," I cried, "and all seemed exceptionally well." "The calm before the storm, perhaps," she murmured. Just at that moment I heard a boy crying in the street, "Pall Mall Gazette, 'Year Special Edition. Shocking tragedy at the West End. Awful murder. 'Year Special Globe. Pall Mall Extra Special.'" A weird tremor broke over me. I walked down into the street and bought a paper. There it stared me in the face on the middle page: "Tragedy at Campden Hill. Well-known barrister murders his wife. Sensational details." I looked closer and read. It was as I feared: the Legates. After I left their house the night before, husband and wife must have quarreled, no doubt, over the question of the children's schooling, and at some provoking word, as it seemed, Hugo must have snatched up a knife, a little ornamental Norwegian dagger, the report said, which happened to lie close by on the cabinet in the drawing room, and plunged it into his wife's heart. The unhappy lady died instantaneously, by all appearances, and the dastardly crime was not discovered by the servants till 8 o'clock this morning. Mr. Legate is missing. I rushed up with the news to Nurse Wade, who was at work in the accident ward. She turned pale, but bent over her patient and said nothing. "It is fearful to think," I groaned out at last, "for us who know all, that poor Legate will be hanged for it, hanged for attempting to protect his children." "He will not be hanged," my witch answered, with the same unquestioning confidence as ever. "Why not?" I asked, astonished once more at this bold prediction. She went on bandaging the arm of the patient whom she was attending. "Because he will commit suicide," she replied without moving a muscle. "How do you know that?" She stuck a steel safety pin with deft fingers into the roll of lint. "When I have finished my day's work," she answered slowly, still continuing the bandage, "I may perhaps find time to tell you." End of chapter 3, part 2. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 4, part 1 of Hilda Wade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Hilda Wade, A Woman with Tenacity of Purpose, by Grant Allen. Chapter 4, Part 1. The episode of the man who would not commit suicide. After my poor friend Legate had murdered his wife, in a sudden access of uncontrollable anger, under the deepest provocation, the police naturally began to inquire for him. It is a way they have. The police are no respecters of persons, neither do they pry into the question of motives. They are but poor casuists. A murder is for them a murder, and a murderer a murderer. It is not their habit to divide and distinguish between case and case with Hilda Wade's analytical accuracy. As soon as my duties at St. Nathaniel's permitted me on the evening of the discovery, I rushed round to Mrs. Mallett's, Legate's sister. I had been detained at the hospital for some hours, however, watching a critical case, and by the time I reached Great Stanhope Street I found Hilda Wade in her nurse's dress there before me. Sebastian, it seemed, had given her leave out for the evening. She was a supernumerary nurse attached to his own observation cots, as special attendant for scientific purposes, and she could generally get an hour or so whenever she required it. Mrs. Mallet had been in the breakfast room with Hilda before I arrived, but as I reached the house she rushed upstairs to wash her red eyes and compose herself a little before the strain of meeting me. So I had the opportunity for a few words alone first with my prophetic companion. "You said just now at Nathaniel's," I burst out, "that Legate would not be hanged, he would commit suicide. What did you mean by that? What reason had you for thinking so?" Hilda sank into a chair by the open window, pulled a flower abstractedly from the vase at her side, and began picking it to pieces, floret after floret, with twitching fingers. She was deeply moved. "Well, consider his family history," she burst out at last, looking up at me with her large brown eyes as she reached the last petal. Heredity counts! And after such a disaster! She said disaster, not crime. I noted mentally the reservation implied in the word. Heredity counts, I answered. Oh, yes, it counts much. But what about Legate's family history? I could not recall any instance of suicide among his forebears. Well, his mother's father was General Fascally, you know, she replied after a pause in her strange oblique manner. Mr. Legate is General Fascally's eldest grandson. Exactly, I broke in, with a man's desire for solid fact in place of vague intuition. But I fail to see quite what that has to do with it. The general was killed in India during the mutiny. I remember, of course. Killed bravely fighting. Yes, but it was on a forlorn hope for which he volunteered, and in the course of which he is said to have walked straight into an almost obvious ambuscade of the enemy's. Now, my dear Miss Wade, I always dropped the title of nurse by request when once we were well clear of Nathaniel's. I have every confidence, you are aware, in your memory and your insight, but I do confess I fail to see what bearing this incident can have on poor Hugo's chances of being hanged or committing suicide. She picked a second flower, and once more pulled out petal after petal. As she reached the last again, she answered slowly: "You must have forgotten the circumstances. It was no mere accident. General Fascally had made a serious strategical blunder at Yanzi. He had sacrificed the lives of his subordinates needlessly. He could not bear to face the survivors. In the course of the retreat he volunteered to go on this forlorn hope, which might equally well have been led by an officer of lower rank, and he was permitted to do so by Sir Colin in command, as a means of retrieving his lost military character. He carried his point, but he carried it recklessly, taking care to be shot through the heart himself in the first onslaught. That was virtual suicide, honorable suicide to avoid disgrace, at a moment of supreme remorse and horror." "You are right," I admitted after a minute's consideration. "I see it now, though I should never have thought of it." "That is the use of being a woman," she answered. I waited a second once more and mused. "Still, that is only one doubtful case," I objected. "There was another, you must remember, his uncle Alfred." "Alfred Legate?" "No, he died in his bed quietly. Alfred Fascally." "What a memory you have!" I cried, astonished. "Why, that was before our time, in the days of the Chartist riots." She smiled, a certain curious Sibylline smile of hers. Her earnest face looked prettier than ever. "I told you I could remember many things that happened before I was born," she answered. "This is one of them." "You remember it directly?" "How impossible! Have I not often explained to you that I am no diviner? I read no book of fate. I call no spirits from the vasty deep. I simply remember with exceptional clearness what I read and hear. And I have many times heard the story about Alfred Fascally." "So have I, but I forget it." "Unfortunately, I can't forget. That is a sort of disease with me. He was a special constable in the Chartist riots, and being a very strong and powerful man, like his nephew Hugo, he used his truncheon, his special constable's baton, or whatever you call it, with excessive force upon a starveling London tailor in the mob near Charing Cross. The man was hit on the forehead, badly hit, so that he died almost immediately of concussion of the brain. A woman rushed out of the crowd at once, seized the dying man, laid his head on her lap, and shrieked out in a wildly despairing voice that he was her husband, and the father of 13 children. Alfred Fascally, who never meant to kill the man,
or even to hurt him, but who was laying about him roundly, without realizing the terrific force of his blows, was so horrified at what he had done when he heard the woman's cry, that he rushed off straight to Waterloo Bridge in an agony of remorse and flung himself over. He was drowned instantly." "I recall the story now," I answered. "But do you know, as it was told me, I think they said the mob threw Fazcali over in their desire for vengeance." "That is the official account as told by the legates and the Fazcalis. They like to have it believed their kinsman was murdered, not that he committed suicide. But my grandfather—" I started. During the 12 months that I had been brought into daily relations with Hilda Wade, that was the first time I had heard her mention any member of her own family, except once her mother. "My grandfather, who knew him well, and who was present in the crowd at the time, assured me many times that Alfred Fazcali really jumped over of his own accord, not pursued by the mob, and that his last horrified words as he leaped were, 'I never meant it, I never meant it.' However, the family have always had luck in their suicides. The jury believed the throwing over story, and found a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown." "Luck in their suicides! What a curious phrase! And you say always? Were there other cases then?" "Constructively, yes. One of the legates, you must recollect, went down with his ship, just like his uncle the general in India, when he might have quitted her. It is believed he had given a mistaken order. You remember, of course, he was navigating lieutenant. Another Marquess was said to have shot himself by accident while cleaning his gun, after a quarrel with his wife. But you have heard all about it. The wrong was on my side, he moaned, you know, when they picked him up dying in the gun room. And one of the Fazcali girls, his cousin of whom his wife was jealous, that beautiful Linda, became a Catholic, and went into a convent at once on Marcus's death, which after all in such cases is merely a religious and moral way of committing suicide. I mean, for a woman who takes the veil just to cut herself off from the world, and who has no vocation, as I hear she had not." She filled me with amazement. "That is true," I exclaimed, "when one comes to think of it. It shows the same temperament in fiber, but I should never have thought of it." "No? Well, I believe it is true, for all that. In every case one sees they choose much the same way of meeting a reverse, a blunder, an unpremeditated crime. The brave way is to go through with it, and face the music, letting what will come. The cowardly way is to hide one's head incontinently in a river, a nose, or a convent cell." "Legate is not a coward," I interposed with warmth. "No, not a coward. A manly spirited, great hearted gentleman, but still not quite of the bravest type. He lacks one element. The legates have physical courage enough and to spare, but their moral courage fails them at a pinch. They rush into suicide or its equivalent at critical moments, out of pure boyish impulsiveness." A few minutes later Mrs. Mallet came in. She was not broken down. On the contrary, she was calm, stoically, tragically, pitiably calm, with that ghastly calmness which is more terrible by far than the most demonstrative grief. Her face, though deadly white, did not move a muscle. Not a tear was in her eyes. Even her bloodless hands hardly twitched at the folds of her hastily assumed black gown. She clenched them after a minute, when she had grasped mine silently. I could see that the nails dug deep into the palms in her painful resolve to keep herself from collapsing. Hilda Wade, with infinite sisterly tenderness, led her over to a chair by the window in the summer twilight, and took one quivering hand in hers.
I have been telling Dr. Cumberledge, Lina, about what I most fear for your dear brother, darling, and I think he agrees with me." Mrs. Mallet turned to me with hollow eyes, still preserving her tragic calm. "I'm afraid of it too," she said, her drawn lips tremulous. "Dr. Cumberledge, we must get him back. We must induce him to face it." "And yet," I answered slowly, turning it over in my own mind, "he has run away at first. Why should he do that if he means to commit suicide?" I hated to utter the words before that broken soul, but there was no way out of it. Hilda interrupted me with a quiet suggestion. "How do you know he has run away?" she asked. "Are you not taking it for granted that, if he meant suicide, he would blow his brains out in his own house? But surely that would not be the Legate way. They are gentle natured folk. They would never blow their brains out or cut their throats. For all we know, he may have made straight for Waterloo Bridge." She framed her lips to the unspoken words, unseen by Mrs. Mallet, "like his uncle Alfred." "That is true," I answered, lip reading. "I never thought of that either." "Still I do not attach importance to this idea," she went on. "I have some reason for thinking he has run away elsewhere, and if so, our first task must be to entice him back again." "What are your reasons?" I asked humbly. Whatever they might be, I knew enough of Hilda Wade by this time to know that she had probably good grounds for accepting them. "Oh, they may wait for the present," she answered. "Other things are more pressing. First, let Lina tell us what she thinks of most moment." Mrs. Mallet braced herself up visibly to a distressing effort. "You have seen the body of Dr. Cumberledge?" she faltered. "No, dear Mrs. Mallet, I have not. I came straight from Nathaniel's. I have had no time to see it." "Dr. Sebastian has viewed it by my wish. He has been so kind, and he will be present at representing the family at the post mortem. He notes that the wound was inflicted with a dagger, a small ornamental Norwegian dagger, which always lay, as I know, on the little whatnot by the blue sofa." I nodded assent. "Exactly. I have seen it there." "It was blunt and rusty, a mere toy knife, not at all the sort of weapon a man would make use of who designed to commit a deliberate murder. The crime, if there was a crime, which we do not admit, must therefore have been wholly unpremeditated." I bowed my head. For us who knew Hugo that goes without saying. She leaned forward eagerly. "Dr. Sebastian has pointed out to me a line of defense which would probably succeed if we could only induce poor Hugo to adopt it. He has examined the blade and scabbard and finds that the dagger fits its sheath very tight, so that it can only be withdrawn with considerable violence. The blade sticks." I nodded again. "It needs a hard pull to wrench it out. He has also inspected the wound, and assures me its character is such that it might have been self-inflicted." She paused now and again, and brought out her words with difficulty. "Self-inflicted, he suggests, therefore, that this may have happened. It is admitted, will be admitted. The servants overheard it. We can make no reservation there. A difference of opinion, an altercation even took place between Hugo and Clara that evening." She started suddenly. "Why, it was only last night. It seems like ages. An altercation about the children's schooling. Clara held strong views on the subject of the children," her eyes blinked hard, "which Hugo did not share. We throw out the hint, then, that Clara, during the course of the dispute, we must call it a dispute, accidentally took up this dagger and toyed with it. You know her habit of toying when she had no knitting or needlework. In the course of playing with it, we suggest, she tried to pull the knife out of its sheath, failed, held it up so, point upward, pulled again, pulled harder, with a jerk. At last the sheath came off. The dagger sprang up. It wounded Clara fatally."
Hugo, knowing that they had disagreed, knowing that the servants had heard, and seeing her fall suddenly dead before him, was seized with horror. The legate impulsiveness, lost his head, rushed out, fancied the accident would be mistaken for murder. But why? A Q.C., don't you know? Recently married, most attached to his wife. It is plausible, isn't it? So plausible, I answered, looking it straight in the face, that it has but one weak point. We might make a coroner's jury, or even a common jury, accept it on Sebastian's expert evidence. Sebastian can work wonder, but we could never make. Hilda Wade finished the sentence for me as I paused. Hugo Legate consent to advance it? I lowered my head. You have said it, I answered. Not for the children's sake? Mrs. Mallet cried with clasped hands. Not for the children's sake even, I answered. Consider for a moment, Mrs. Mallet. Is it true? Do you believe it? She threw herself back in her chair with a dejected face. Oh, as for that, she cried, wearily crossing her hands, before you and Hilda, who know all, what need to prevaricate? How can I believe it? We understand how it came about. That woman, that woman. The real wonder is, Hilda murmured, soothing her white hand, that he contained himself so long. Well, we all know Hugo, I went on as quietly as I was able, and knowing Hugo, we know that he might be urged to commit this wild act in a fierce moment of indignation, righteous indignation on behalf of his motherless girls, under tremendous provocation. But we also know that having once committed it, he would never stoop to disown it by a subterfuge. The heartbroken sister let her head drop faintly. So Hilda told me, she murmured, and what Hilda says in these matters is almost always final. We debated the question for some minutes more. Then Mrs. Mallet cried at last. At any rate, he has fled for the moment, and his flight alone brings the worst suspicion upon him. That is our chief point. We must find out where he is, and if he has gone right away, we must bring him back to London. Where do you think he has taken refuge? The police, Dr. Sebastian has ascertained, are watching the railway stations and the ports for the continent. Very like the police, Hilda exclaimed, with more than a touch of contempt in her voice. As if a clever man of the world like Hugo Legate would run away by rail, or start off to the continent. Every Englishman is noticeable on the continent. It would be sheer madness. You think he is not gone there, then? I cried, deeply interested. Of course not. That is the point I hinted at just now. He has defended many persons accused of murder, and he often spoke to me of their incredible folly when trying to escape in going by rail or in setting out from England for Paris. An Englishman, he used to say, is least observed in his own country. In this case I think I know where he's gone, how he went there. Where, then? Where comes last, how first? It is a question of inference. Explain, we know your powers. Well, I take it for granted that he killed her. We must not mince matters. About 12 o'clock, for after that hour the servants told Lena there was quiet in the drawing room. Next, I conjecture, he went upstairs to change his clothes. He could not go forth on the world in an evening suit, and the housemaid says his black coat and trousers were lying as usual on a chair in his dressing room, which shows at least that he was not unduly flurried. After that he put on another suit, no doubt. What suit I hope the police will not discover too soon, for I suppose you must just accept the situation that we are conspiring to defeat the ends of justice. No, no, Mrs. Mallet cried, to bring him back voluntarily that he may face his trial like a man. Yes, dear, that is quite right. However,
The next thing, of course, would be that he would shave in whole or in part. His big black beard was so very conspicuous. He would certainly get rid of that before attempting to escape. The servants being in bed, he was not pressed for time. He had the whole night before him, so of course he shaved. On the other hand, the police, you may be sure, will circulate his photograph. We must not shirk these points," for Mrs. Mallet winced again. "Will circulate his photograph, beard and all, and that will really be one of our great safeguards, for the bushy beard so masks the face that, without it, Hugo would be scarcely recognizable. I conclude, therefore, that he must have shorn himself before leaving home, though naturally I did not make the police a present of the hint by getting Lena to ask any questions in that direction of the housemaid." "You are probably right," I answered. "But would he have a razor?" "I was coming to that. No, certainly he would not. He had not shaved for years, and they kept no manservants, which makes it difficult for him to borrow one from a sleeping man. So what he would do would doubtless be to cut off his beard, or part of it, quite close, with a pair of scissors, and then get himself properly shaved next morning in the first country town he came to." "The first country town?" "Certainly. That leads up to the next point. We must try to be cool and collected." She was quivering with suppressed emotion herself as she said it, but her soothing hand still lay on Mrs. Mallett's. "The next thing is, he would leave London." "But not by rail, you say?" "He is an intelligent man, and, in the course of defending others, has thought about this matter. Why expose himself to the needless risk and observation of a railway station? No, I saw at once what he would do. Beyond doubt he would cycle. He always wondered it was not done oftener, under similar circumstances." "But has his bicycle gone?" Lena looked. "It has not. I should have expected as much. I told her to note that point very unobtrusively, so as to avoid giving the police the clue. She saw the machine in the outer hall as usual." "He is too good a criminal lawyer to have dreamt of taking his own," Mrs. Mallet interposed with another effort. "But where could he have hired or bought one at that time of night?" I exclaimed. "Nowhere, without exciting the gravest suspicion. Therefore I conclude he stopped in London for the night, sleeping at an hotel, without luggage, and paying for his room in advance. It is frequently done, and if he arrived late, very little notice would be taken of him. Big hotels about the Strand, I'm told, have always a dozen such casual bachelor guests every evening." "And then?" "And then, this morning, he would buy a new bicycle, a different make from his own, at the nearest shop, would rig himself out at some ready-made tailor's, with a fresh tourist suit, probably an ostentatiously tweedy bicycling suit, and with that in his luggage carrier, would make straight on his machine for the country. He could change in some copse, and bury his own clothes, avoiding the blunders he has seen in others. Perhaps he might ride for the first 20 or 30 miles out of London to some minor side station, and then go on by train towards his destination, quitting the rail again at some unimportant point where the main west road crosses the Great Western or the South Western line." "Great Western or South Western? Why those two in particular?" "Then you have settled in your own mind which direction he has taken?" "Pretty well, I judge by analogy. Lena, your brother was brought up in the West Country, was he not?" Mrs. Mallet gave a weary nod. "In North Devon," she answered, "on the wild stretch of moor about Hartland and Clovelly." Hilda Wade seemed to collect herself. "Now, Mr. Legate is essentially a Celt in temperament," she went on. "He comes by origin and ancestry from a rough, heather-clad country. He belongs to the moorland. In other words, his type is the mountaineer's. But a mountaineer's instinct in similar circumstances is what?
Why, to fly straight to his native mountains. In an agony of terror, in an excess of despair, when all else fails, he strikes a bee line for the hills he loves, rationally or irrationally. He seems to think he can hide there. Hugo Legate, with his frank boyish nature, his great Devonian frame, is sure to have done so. I know his mood. He has made for the West Country." "You are right, Hilda," Mrs. Mallet exclaimed with conviction. "I am quite sure, from what I know of Hugo, that to go to the West would be his first impulse." "And the Legates are always governed by first impulses," my character reader added. She was quite correct. From the time we two were at Oxford together, I as an undergraduate, he as a don, I had always noticed that marked trait in my dear old friend's temperament. After a short pause, Hilda broke the silence again. "The sea again, the sea! The Legates love the water. Was there any place on the sea where he went much as a boy? Any lonely place? I mean, in that North Devon district?" Mrs. Mallet reflected a moment. "Yes, there was a little bay, a mere gap in high cliffs, with some fishermen's huts and a few yards of beach, where he used to spend much of his holidays. It was a weird looking break in a grim sea wall of dark red rocks, where the tide rose high, rolling in from the Atlantic." "The very thing! Has he visited since he grew up?" "To my knowledge, never." Hilda's voice had a ring of certainty. "Then that is where we shall find him, dear. We must look there first. He is sure to revisit just such a solitary spot by the sea when trouble overtakes him." End of chapter 4, part 1. Read by Lars Rolander.
Part 2 of Hilda Wade. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Hilda Wade, A Woman with Tenacity of Purpose by Grant Allen. Chapter 4, Part 2. Later in the evening, as we were walking home towards Nathaniel's together, I asked Hilda why she had spoken throughout with such unwavering confidence. "Oh, it was simple enough," she answered. "There were two things that helped me through, which I didn't like to mention in detail before Lena. One was this: the Legates have all of them an instinctive horror of the sight of blood. Therefore they almost never commit suicide by shooting themselves or cutting their throats. Marcus, who shot himself in the gun room, was an exception to both rules. He never minded blood. He could cut up a deer. But Hugo refused to be a doctor because he could not stand the sight of an operation. And even as a sportsman he never liked to pick up or handle the game he had shot himself. He said it sickened him. He rushed from that room last night, I feel sure, in a physical horror at the deed he had done, and by now he is as far as he can get from London. The sight of his act drove him away, not craven fear of an arrest. If the Legates kill themselves, a seafaring race on the whole, their impulse is to trust to water." "And the other thing?" "Well, that was about the mountaineer's homing instinct. I have often noticed it. I could give you 50 instances, only I didn't like to speak of them before Lena. There was Williams, for example, the doll jelly man who killed a gamekeeper at Petworth in a poaching affray. He was taken on Cadair Idris, skulking among rocks a week later. Then there was that unhappy young fellow, Mackinnon, who shot his sweetheart at Leicester. He made straight as the crow flies for his home in the Isle of Skye, and there drowned himself in familiar waters. Lindner, the Tyrolese again, who stabbed the American swindler at Monte Carlo, was tracked
after a few days to his native place, Saint Valentine in the Zillertal. It is always so. Mountaineers in distress fly to their mountains. It is a part of their nostalgia. I know it from within, too. If I were in poor Hugo Legate's place, what do you think I would do? Why, hide myself at once in the greenest recesses of our Carnarvonshire mountains."
"What an extraordinary insight into character you have!" I cried. "You seem to divine what everybody's action will be under given circumstances." She paused and held her parasol half poised in her hand. "Character determines action," she said slowly at last. "That is the secret of the great novelists. They put themselves behind and within their characters, and so make us feel that every act of their personages is not only natural, but even, given the conditions, inevitable. We recognize that their story is the sole logical outcome of the interaction of their dramatis personae. Now, I am not a great novelist. I cannot create and imagine characters and situations. But I have something of the novelist's gift. I apply the same method to the real life of the people around me. I try to throw myself into the person of others, and to feel how their character will compel them to act in each set of circumstances to which they may expose themselves." "In one word," I said, "you are a psychologist." "A psychologist," she assented. "I suppose so. And the police, well, the police are not. They are at best but bungling materialists. They require a clue. What need of a clue if you can interpret character?" So certain was Hilda Wade of her conclusions, indeed, that Mrs. Mallotte begged me next day to take my holiday at once, which I could easily do, and go down to the little bay in the Heartland district of which she had spoken, in search of Hugo. I consented. She herself proposed to set out quietly for Bideford, where she could be within easy reach of me, in order to hear of my success or failure, while Hilda Wade, whose summer vacation was to have begun in 2 days' time, offered to ask for an extra day's leave so as to accompany her. The broken hearted sister accepted the offer, and secrecy being above all things necessary, we set off by different routes, the two women by Waterloo, myself by Paddington. We stopped that night at different hotels in Bideford, but next morning Hilda rode out on her bicycle, and accompanied me on mine for a mile or two along the tortuous way towards Heartland. "Take nothing for granted," she said as we parted, "and be prepared to find poor Hugo Legate's appearance greatly changed. He has eluded the police and their clues so far. Therefore, I imagine, he must have largely altered his dress and exterior." "I will find him," I answered, "if he is anywhere within 20 miles of Heartland." She waved her hand to me in farewell. I rode on after she left me towards the high promontory in front, the wildest and least visited part of North Devon. Torrents of rain had fallen during the night. The slimy cart ruts and cattle tracks on the moor were brimming with water. It was a lowering day. The clouds drifted low. Black peat bogs filled the hollows. Gray stone homesteads, lonely and forbidding, stood out here and there against the curved skyline. Even the high road was uneven and in places flooded. For an hour I passed hardly a soul. At last, near a crossroad with a defaced finger post, I descended from my machine and consulted my ordnance map, on which Mrs. Mallet had marked ominously, with a cross of red ink, the exact position of the little fishing hamlet where Hugo used to spend his holidays. I took the turning which seemed to me most likely to lead to it, but the tracks were so confused, and the run of the lanes so uncertain, let alone the map being some years out of date, that I soon felt I had lost my bearings. By a little wayside inn, half hidden in a deep combe, with bog on every side, I descended and asked for a bottle of ginger beer, for the day was hot and close, in spite of the packed clouds. As they were opening the bottle, I inquired casually the way to the Red Gap bathing place. The landlord gave me directions which confused me worse than ever, ending at last with the concise remark, "And then thirty or three more turns to the right and to the left 'ull bring ye right up alongside o't." I despaired of finding the way by these unintelligible sailing orders, but just at that moment, as luck would have it, another cyclist flew past, the first soul I had seen on the road that morning. He was a man with the loose knit air of a shop assistant, badly got up in a rather loud and obtrusive tourist suit of brown homespun with baggy knickerbockers and thin thread stockings. I judged him a gentleman on the cheap at sight. "Very stylish this suit, complete, only 37 and sixpence." The landlady glanced out at him with a friendly nod. He turned and smiled at her, but did not see me, for I stood in the shade behind the half open door. He had a short black moustache and a not unpleasing careless face. His features, I thought, were better than his garments. However, the stranger did not interest me just then. I was far too full of more important matters.
"Why don't he take and follow thick there, gentlemen, sir?"
the landlady said, pointing one large red hand after him.
"Or do go down to Erd Gap to swim every marnin'? Mr. Jan Smith of Oxford they do call un. He can't go wrong if he do follow un to the Gap. Her's lodging to the world warmer moors, and her's that fond o' the say. The fishermen do tell me as wasn't never any gentleman like un."
I tossed off my ginger beer, jumped on to my machine, and followed the retreating brown back of Mr. John Smith of Oxford. Surely a most non committing name. Round sharp corners and over rutty lanes, tire deep in mud, across the rusty red moor, till all at once at a turn a gap of stormy sea appeared wedge shaped between two shelving rock walls. It was a lonely spot. Rocks hemmed it in, big breakers walled it. The sou'wester roared through the gap. I rode down among loose stones and water worn channels in the solid grit very carefully. But the man in brown had torn over the wild path with reckless haste, zigzagging madly, and was now on the little three-cornered patch of beach, undressing himself with a sort of careless glee, and flinging his clothes down anyhow on the shingle beside him. Something about the action caught my eye. That movement of the arm, it was not, it could not be. No, no, not Hugo. A very ordinary person, and Legate bore the stamp of a born gentleman. He stood up bare at last. He flung out his arms as if to welcome the boisterous wind to his naked bosom. Then, with a sudden burst of recognition, the man stood revealed. We had bathed together 100 times in London and elsewhere. The face, the clad figure, the dress, all were different, but the body, the actual frame and make of the man, the well-knit limbs, the splendid trunk, no disguise could alter. It was Legate himself, big, powerful, vigorous. That ill-made suit, those baggy knickerbockers, the slouched cap, the thin thread stockings, had only distorted and hidden his figure. Now that I saw him as he was, he came out the same bold and manly form as ever. He did not notice me. He rushed down with a certain wild joy into the turbulent water, and plunging in with a loud cry, buffeted the huge waves with those strong curving arms of his. The sou'wester was rising. Each breaker as it reared caught him on its crest and tumbled him over like a cork, but like a cork he rose again. He was swimming now, arm over arm, straight out seaward. I saw the lifted hands between the crest and the trough. For a moment I hesitated whether I ought to strip and follow him. Was he doing as so many others of his house had done, courting death from the water? But some strange hand restrained me. Who was I that I should stand between Hugo Legate
and the ways of Providence. The legates loved ever the ordeal by water. Presently he turned again. Before he turned, I had taken the opportunity to look hastily at his clothes. Hilda Wade had surmised aright once more. The outer suit was a cheap affair from a big ready-made tailor's in St. Martin's Lane, turned out by the thousand. The underclothing, on the other hand, was new and unmarked, but fine in quality, bought, no doubt, at Bidford. An eerie sense of doom stole over me. I felt the end was near. I withdrew behind a big rock and waited there unseen till Hugo had landed. He began to dress again, without troubling to dry himself. I drew a deep breath of relief. Then this was not suicide. By the time he had pulled on his vest and drawers, I came out suddenly from my ambush and faced him. A fresh shock awaited me. I could hardly believe my eyes. It was not Legate. No, nor anything like him. Nevertheless, the man rose with a little cry and advanced half crouching towards me. "You are not hunting me down with the police?" he exclaimed, his neck held low and his forehead wrinkling. The voice was Legate's. It was an unspeakable mystery. "Hugo," I cried, "dear Hugo, hunting you down! Could you imagine it?" He raised his head, strode forward, and grasped my hand. "Forgive me, Cumberledge," he cried, "but a proscribed and hounded man. If you knew what a relief it is to me to get out on the water." "You forget all there?" "I forget it, the red horror." "You mean just now to drown yourself?" "No, if I had meant it, I would have done it. Hubert, for my children's sake, I will not commit suicide." "Then listen," I cried. I told him in a few words of his sister's scheme, Sebastian's defense, the plausibility of the explanation, the whole long story. He gazed at me moodily, yet it was not Hugo. "No, no," he said shortly, and as he spoke it was he. "I have done it. I have killed her. I will not owe my life to a falsehood." "Not for the children's sake?" He dashed his hand down impatiently. "I have a better way for the children. I will save them still. Hubert, you are not afraid to speak to a murderer?" "Dear Hugo, I know all, and to know all is to forgive all." He grasped my hand once more. "Know all!" he cried with a despairing gesture. "Oh no! No one knows all but myself, not even the children. But the children know much. They will forgive me. Lena knows something. She will forgive me. You know a little. You forgive me. The world can never know. It will brand my darlings as a murderer's children." "It was the act of a minute," I interposed, "and, though she is dead, poor lady, and one must speak no ill of her, we can at least gather dimly for your children's sake how deep was the provocation." He gazed at me fixedly. His voice was like lead. "For the children's sake, yes," he answered as in a dream. "It was all for the children. I have killed her, murdered her. She has paid her penalty, and, poor dead soul, I will utter no word against her, the woman I have murdered. But one thing I will say. If omniscient justice sends me for this to eternal punishment, I can endure it gladly, like a man, knowing that so I have redeemed my Marian's motherless girls from a deadly tyranny." It was the only sentence in which he ever alluded to her. I sat down by his side and watched him closely. Mechanically, methodically, he went on with his dressing. The more he dressed, the less could I believe it was Hugo. I had expected to find him close shaven, so did the police, by their printed notices. Instead of that, he had shaved his beard and whiskers, but only trimmed his moustache, trimmed it quite short, so as to reveal the boyish corners of the mouth, a trick which entirely altered his rugged expression. But that was not all. What puzzled me most was the eyes.
They were not Hugo's. At first I could not imagine why. By degrees the truth dawned upon me. His eyebrows were naturally thick and shaggy, great overhanging growth, interspersed with many of those stiff long hairs to which Darwin called attention in certain men as surviving traits from a monkey like ancestor. In order to disguise himself, Hugo had pulled out all these coarser hairs, leaving nothing on his brows but the soft and closely pressed coat of down which underlies the longer bristles in all such cases. This had wholly altered the expression of the eyes, which no longer looked out keenly from their cavernous penthouse, but being deprived of their relief, had acquired a much more ordinary and less individual aspect. From a good-natured but shaggy giant, my old friend was transformed by his shaving and his costume into a well-fed and well-grown, but not very colossal commercial gentleman. Hugo was scarcely 6 feet high, indeed, though by his broad shoulders and bushy beard he had always impressed one with such a sense of size. And now that the hirsuteness had been got rid of, and the dress altered, he hardly struck one as taller or bigger than the average of his fellows. We sat for some minutes and talked. Legate would not speak of Clara, and when I asked him his intentions, he shook his head moodily. "I shall act for the best," he said. "What of best is left to guard the dear children. It was a terrible price to pay for their redemption, but it was the only one possible, and in a moment of wrath I paid it. Now I have to pay in turn myself. I do not shirk it." "You will come back to London then, and stand your trial?" I asked eagerly. "Come back to London?" he cried with a face of white panic. Hitherto he had seemed to me rather relieved in expression than otherwise. His countenance had lost its worn and anxious look. He was no longer watching each moment over his children's safety. "Come back to London and face my trial. Why did you think, Hubert, it was the court or the hanging I was shirking? No, no, not that, but it, the red horror. I must get away from it to the sea, to the water, to wash away the stain, as far from it, that red pool, as possible." I answered nothing. I left him to face his own remorse in silence. At last he rose to go, and held one foot undecided on his bicycle. "I leave myself in Heaven's hands," he said as he lingered. "It will require. The ordeal is by water." "So I judged," I answered. "Tell Lena this from me," he went on, still loitering, "that if she will trust me, I will strive to do the best that remains for my darlings. I will do it, Heaven helping. She will know what tomorrow." He mounted his machine and sailed off. My eyes followed him up the path with sad forebodings. All day long I loitered about the gap. It consisted of two bays, the one I had already seen, and another divided from it by a saw edge of rock. In the further cove crouched a few low stone cottages. A broad bottomed sailing boat lay there, pulled up high on the beach. About 3 o'clock, as I sat and watched, two men began to launch it. The sea ran high, tide coming in, the sou'wester still increasing in force to a gale. At the signal staff on the cliff the danger cone was hoisted. White spray danced in air. Big black clouds rolled up seething from windward. Low thunder rumbling. A storm threatened. One of the men was Legate, the other a fisherman. He jumped in and put off through the surf with an air of triumph. He was a splendid sailor. His boat leapt through the breakers and flew before the wind with a mere rag of canvas. "Dangerous weather to be out," I exclaimed to the fisherman, who stood with hands buried in his pockets, watching him. "Ah, that her be sure," the man answered. "Don't like the look o' it. But thick there gentleman, he's one o' Oxford, he do tell me, and they'm a main venturesome lot, they college folk.
He's off by hisself through the storm, also where as Lundy."
"Will he reach it?" I asked anxiously, having my own idea on the subject.
"Don't seem like it, sir, do it? Ur mustn't, and yet again ur must. Powerful hard place ur be to make in a storm, to be sure, Lundy. Said the Lord 'ud decide, but ur 'udn't be warned, ur 'udn't. And foolhardy folk, as the saying is, must go their own foolhardy way to perdition." It was the last I saw of Legate alive. Next morning the lifeless body of the man who was wanted for the Campden Hill mystery was cast up by the waves on the shore of Lundy. The Lord had decided. Hugo had not miscalculated. Luck in their suicides, Hilda Wade said, and strange to say the luck of the legate stood him in good stead still. By a miracle of fate his children were not branded as a murderer's daughters. Sebastian gave evidence at the inquest on the wife's body. Self-inflicted, a recoil, accidental, I'm sure of it. His specialist knowledge, his assertive certainty, combined with that arrogant, masterful manner of his, and his keen eagle eye, overbore the jury. Awed by the great man's look, they brought in a submissive verdict of death by misadventure. The coroner thought it a most proper finding. Mrs. Mallet had made the most of the innate legate horror of blood. The newspapers charitably surmised that the unhappy husband, crazed by the instantaneous unexpectedness of his loss, had wandered away like a madman to the scenes of his childhood, and had there been drowned by accident while trying to cross a stormy sea to Lundy, under some wild impression that he would find his dead wife alive on the island. Nobody whispered murder. Everybody dwelt on the utter absence of motive. A model husband, such a charming young wife, and such a devoted stepmother. We three alone knew. We three and the children. On the day when the jury brought in their verdict at the adjourned inquest on Mrs. Legate, Hilda Wade stood in the room, trembling and white-faced, awaiting their decision. When the foreman uttered the words, "Death by misadventure," she burst into tears of relief. "He did well," she cried to me passionately. "He did well, that poor father. He placed his life in the hands of his Maker, asking only for mercy to his innocent children, and mercy has been shown to him and to them. He was taken gently in the way he wished. It would have broken my heart for those two poor girls if the verdict had gone otherwise. He knew how terrible a lot it is to be called a murderer's daughter." I did not realize at the time with what profound depth of personal feeling she said it. End of chapter 4, part 2. Read by Lars Rolander.